Perceptive broadening. Through exploratory engagement. Sometimes something becomes psychologically difficult before we even begin. A creative project sits untouched for months. A conversation feels too important to start. A relationship becomes tense before anything happens. A habit narrows into repetition. Even things we genuinely care about can begin feeling psychologically heavy before we engage with them. Not always because we do not care, sometimes because the engagement itself has become too rigid. Over time, activities can become psychologically compressed around singular outcomes: getting it right, avoiding failure, making the correct choice, protecting meaning, avoiding irreversible mistakes, proving something about ourselves. And when this happens, the perceptive field surrounding the activity begins narrowing. The activity stops feeling open, stops feeling flexible, stops feeling inhabitable. Instead of containing multiple possible continuations, adjustments, interactions, and forms of participation, everything begins collapsing into one pressured continuity, one correct outcome, one correct version, one correct beginning. Participation itself starts feeling overloaded. I noticed this while trying to start a woodworking project. For months a large log sat untouched because I had attached it to one very specific idea: carving a gauntlet. The more psychologically important the project became, the narrower the perceptive field surrounding it became. The wood stopped feeling like material. It started feeling like consequence. Everything collapsed around the first cut. What if I ruined it? What if the shape was wrong? What if I wasted the material? What if I failed the idea before it even existed? The project remained conceptual, untouched, compressed around one singular imagined continuity. The log became the possibility. But once interaction actually began, the perceptive field started widening. The original attempt revealed incompatibilities that could not be fully understood while the project remained conceptual. The grinder behaved differently than expected. The wood resisted shaping in ways that changed the interaction. Some approaches simply did not work, but instead of reinforcing rigidity, these interactions began opening additional continuations. The log became one possibility instead of the possibility. Different woods became possible, smaller projects became possible, different forms became possible, experimentation became possible. A failed cut no longer collapsed the entire engagement structure surrounding woodworking. It redirected participation into other accessible pathways. The activity gradually stopped reforming through one singular pressured continuity and began reforming through multiple lived interactions instead. Woodworking stopped existing only as anticipation. It began existing as participation. Through repetition, experimentation, familiarity, mistakes, adjustment, environmental interaction, and unfolding continuity, woodworking gradually became broader, more flexible, and more inhabitable. Not because uncertainty disappeared, not because every outcome became successful, but because additional pathways of participation became accessible. And over time, woodworking stopped feeling like one fragile high-pressure project suspended above action. It became something you could return to. Perceptive broadening occurs when an activity stops existing as one singular pressured possibility and begins reopening into multiple accessible continuations. The engagement becomes less psychologically totalized. Participation no longer depends entirely on one correct outcome in order to remain meaningful or accessible. The activity becomes broader, more flexible, more inhabitable, not because pressure disappears entirely, but because the perceptive field surrounding the engagement no longer collapses around pressure alone. That is the core idea behind perceptive broadening through exploratory engagement. Sometimes exploratory interaction changes the way engagement itself is perceptually organized. The activity stops collapsing into singular pressured continuities and begins opening into multiple accessible forms of participation. Through experimentation, partial participation, environmental feedback, mistakes, adjustment, repetition, and lived interaction engagement can begin reforming through broader participatory pathways. And as the perceptive field broadens, the psychological threshold required to engage can begin reducing as well. The goal is not endless uncertainty or permanent exploration. The goal is not avoiding commitment or convergence. The goal is to reduce rigidity long enough for participation to gradually settle into forms that are more livable, flexible, and naturally accessible again, because sometimes the problem is not that we do not want to engage. Sometimes engagement has become too narrowly compressed around pressure alone, and sometimes participation itself is what slowly opens the field again.